Blood and roasted marrow thickened the air. King Kaelin hated feasts. He hated the noise, the posturing lords, the stench of stale ale. Then, a servant carrying slop buckets brushed past his chair. The world didn't stop. It shattered. The air turned to ash and raw iron. Meat grease coated the roof of Kaelin's mouth. It was the winter solstice feast. An endless, droning affair of roasted boar, heavy red wine, and the sweat of 200 wolves packed into the great hall of Ethelgard. The stone walls sweat with damp condensation. Torches smoked, stinging the eyes. Kaelin sat at the high table, a heavy iron crown biting into his forehead. He was 42, scarred across the throat, and exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. His wolf, the massive, hulking spirit of the Alpha King, had been asleep for a decade. Not dead, just dormant. Numbed by the endless wars, the trade disputes, the petitions over stolen sheep and border skirmishes. He drank his wine. It tasted like vinegar. Below him, hounds snarled over thrown bones. A pair of young betas were wrestling near the hearth, knocking over a bench to the roaring laughter of the crowd. It was loud, too loud. Kaelin rubbed his temple. His right knee throbbed, a lasting gift from a skirmish in the northern passes 5 years ago. He just wanted to go to his chambers, strip off the velvet doublet that scratched his neck, and stand in the freezing wind by his window. Then she walked past. She wasn't supposed to be near the high table. She was a scullion, wearing a tunic of undyed, coarse wool that looked like it had been salvaged from a grain sack. Her hair was chopped short, jagged, the color of dirty straw. She carried a wooden bucket of slops, scraped plates, gristle, half-eaten bread weighing heavily against her thigh. She smelled like wet ash, harsh lye soap, and old grease. She was entirely unremarkable. Invisible. Until the draft from the main doors shifted, it caught the scent, trapped beneath the lye, and the kitchen filth, carrying it directly across Kaelin's face. It wasn't a sweet smell. It wasn't roses or jasmine or the heavy musk of the high-born females who paraded before him. It smelled like cracked ice over a rushing river. It smelled like crushed pine needles and copper. Mine. The voice in Kaelin's head wasn't a thought. It was a physical blow. The sleeping beast inside him didn't wake gently. It violently tore itself from its slumber, slamming against the inside of Kaelin's ribs so hard his breath left him in a sharp, wet gasp. His vision tunneled. The roaring noise of the great hall snapped into complete, deafening silence. The only sound in the universe was the heavy, uneven thud of the girl's boots on the flagstones. Thud. Thud. Kaelin's hand spasmed. The silver goblet he was holding crumpled like tin. Dark red wine spilled over his knuckles, dripping down onto the heavy oak table, pooling like fresh blood. He didn't notice. He couldn't breathe. His lungs were locked, the muscles in his neck strained, thick cords popping against his scarred skin. He stared at her back as she moved toward the servant's exit. She paused, just for a fraction of a second. Her shoulders went completely rigid. The bucket in her hand swung slightly, sloshing gray water onto the rushes. She felt it too. She didn't turn around. She didn't look at him. Her head ducked lower, her chin burying into her chest, and she practically sprinted for the heavy oak door leading to the kitchens. The door slammed shut behind her. The sudden absence of her physical presence felt like a hook had been lodged in Kaelin's chest and yanked, trying to tear his sternum open. "My king?" The voice belonged to Brom, his closest advisor. Brom was leaning over, staring at the crushed goblet, then at Kaelin's face. Kaelin looked down at his hand. The metal was bent perfectly to the shape of his grip. The wine was dripping onto his breeches. He felt nauseous. A cold, clammy sweat broke out across his forehead. His hands were shaking. He times was shaking. The Alpha King, who had slaughtered a rival pack leader with his bare hands, was trembling like a starved dog. "Sire, are you ill?" Brom asked, his voice dropping, eyes scanning the room for threats. "Poison?" "No," Kaelin grated out. His voice didn't sound like his own. It was a guttural, inhuman rasp. He shoved his chair back. The heavy wood screeched against the stone. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the hall, drawing a few confused glances from the nearest tables. He stood. His bad knee almost gave out under the sudden violent surge of adrenaline. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "I need air," Kalen said, the words tasting like copper. "I'll call the guard." "No." Kalen shot Brahm a look that made the older wolf physically recoil. Kalen's eyes had bled from their normal slate gray to a burning, luminous gold. The wolf was at the surface. It was clawing at the back of his eyes, demanding blood, demanding the hunt, demanding the mate. "Let no one follow me," Kalen ordered. He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked down the dais, ignoring the sudden hush that fell over the high table. Every step was a battle for control. His bones ached, shifting slightly, eager to snap and reform into fur and claw. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of his own blood where he had bitten his tongue. He hit the servant's door and pushed it open. The hallway beyond was dark, drafty, and empty, but the air was heavy with her terror. It hung in the shadows like a physical fog. Ice, pine, copper. Kalen closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and let the sickness in his stomach guide him into the dark. Rowan dropped the bucket. It hit the bottom of the stone stairs with a loud crack, spilling congealed gravy and gnawed bones across the landing. She didn't stop to clean it up. She couldn't. Her hands were numb. Her chest felt like it was wrapped in iron bands, pulling tighter with every panicked breath. She scrambled down the corridor, her boots slipping on the damp flags. No, 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 no. The chant played on a loop in her head. She ducked under a low archway, ignoring the shouting of the head cook from the main kitchens. She needed the dark. She needed the earth. She was an Omega, a forgotten, useless thing. In Aethelgard, Omegas weren't pampered or revered. They were commodities. The lucky ones were married off to violent alphas to breed. The unlucky ones were thrown into the pleasure houses or worked to death in the lowest levels of the keep. Rowan had survived by being filthy. She smeared ash on her neck. She chewed raw garlic. She bathed only in harsh lye that stripped her skin raw and killed her natural scent. For 6 years, she had been a shadow, scraping pots and carrying slops, perfectly invisible. Until 5 minutes ago, when the string tying her soul to the world suddenly snapped tight, yanking her violently toward the high table. She had felt the exact moment the Alpha King's eyes hit her. It wasn't a romantic spark. It felt like being targeted by a drawn bow. The sheer, crushing weight of his aura had slammed into her spine, making her knees buckle. Her inner wolf, a small, beaten-down creature she had suppressed since childhood, whimpered and rolled over, exposing its throat in absolute submission. She pushed through a heavy wooden door, the rusted hinges shrieking. She was in the subcellars now. The air here was freezing, smelling of root vegetables rotting in the damp, moldy wood and wet earth. It was pitch black. Rowan stumbled blindly, her hands grazing the rough, slimy stone walls. She found a gap between 2 massive wine casks and wedged herself in. She pulled her knees to her chest and bit down hard on her own forearm, stifling a sob. She was trembling so violently, her teeth rattled. He noticed. The king noticed. What would he do? He was a monster. Everyone knew the stories of Kalen the Black. He had wiped out the entire Sterling line just to secure the western border. He was ruthless, cold, and entirely unhinged. If he found out a scullery maid was his fated mate, he wouldn't elevate her. He would be disgusted. He would snap her neck to sever the bond and spare himself the humiliation. Rowan pressed her face into her dirty knees. She scrubbed frantically at the skin of her neck, trying to rub away the phantom heat that was blooming there. The mating gland beneath her jaw was throbbing, aching with a dull, heavy pulse that synced perfectly with her racing heart. Above her, the ceiling groaned. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and slow. Rowan stopped breathing. She squeezed her eyes shut. The darkness of the cellar was absolute, but she could hear him. The soft times, scuffed times, of a leather boot on stone, the creak of a wooden stair bearing a massive weight. He had followed her. She tasted blood. She had bitten through the skin of her arm. "I can smell your blood," a voice rasped from the darkness. It was a terrible sound. It wasn't loud, but it resonated in the small space, vibrating against the wooden casks and sinking into Rowan's marrow. It was the voice of a predator that had just found a wounded rabbit. Rowan pressed herself backward, her spine grinding against the damp stone wall. There was nowhere left to go. The casks blocked her on both sides. "Come out." The command was laced with alpha compulsion. It wasn't a request. Rowan's body betrayed her. Her muscles spasmed, her hips shifting forward involuntarily to obey. She choked back a cry, digging her fingernails into her own thighs to anchor herself. She wouldn't move. She would rather die in this crack in the wall than drag herself out to be slaughtered. Silence stretched. The dripping of water from the ceiling sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Then, the heavy scent of him flooded the cellar. It overpowered the rot in the mold. It smelled like thunderstorms, ozone, wet slate, and the sharp, burning tang of wood smoke. It was intoxicating. It made Rowan's head spin, her stomach cramped with a sudden, violent knot of need that disgusted her. "You think the dark hides you?" Kaelin's voice was closer now, just on the other side of the casks. Rowan's hand scrambled blindly in the dirt. Her fingers brushed against something hard and cold, a discarded, rusted iron spike used for tapping the barrels. She gripped it, the rough metal biting into her palm. It was a pathetic weapon, a twig against a landslide. But it was something. A shadow moved in the absolute blackness. The air pressure shifted. "Don't," Rowan croaked. Her voice was raspy, unused to speaking above a whisper. "Don't come any closer." Kaelin stopped. He stood in the pitch-black cellar, his chest heaving as if he had just run 10 miles in deep snow. His fine velvet doublet felt like a straitjacket. He wanted to rip it off. He wanted to tear the casks apart with his bare hands and drag her out into the light. His wolf was thrashing, driven mad by the scent of her fear. Mate in danger, mate terrified, comfort, protect, claim. But the fear was directed at times him. That realization felt like a knife slipping between his ribs. He forced himself to breathe out, a long, shuddering exhale. He curled his hands into fists to stop them from reaching into the narrow gap between the barrels. "Put down whatever you're holding," Kaelin said. He tried to soften his voice, to strip the alpha command out of it, but it just sounded broken. "Go away," the voice came from the dark crevice. It was a small voice, trembling, but there was a jagged edge of pure defiance in it. Kaelin closed his eyes, the scent of her ice, pine, copper, and now, the sharp tang of fresh blood was overwhelming his senses. He could hear her heart hammering a frantic bird-like rhythm. "I can't do that," Kaelin said honestly. "You know I can't." "I am nothing," she whispered fiercely. "I am dirt. I am a mistake. Go back to your feast. Tomorrow, you won't even remember this." A harsh, ugly laugh scraped out of Kaelin's throat before he could stop it. "A mistake. Yes. The goddess has a sick sense of humor." He stepped closer to the gap. The proximity made his skin burn. "But you think I could forget? My bones feel like they are turning to glass, girl. My lungs are forgetting how to pull air unless you breathe first." He heard a sharp intake of breath from the dark. "I will kill you," she threatened. Kaelin leaned his shoulder against the damp wood of the barrel. He felt exhausted, suddenly. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the crushing weight of his reality. He was a tired king with a broken kingdom, and his fated mate was a terrified scullion hiding in the dirt with a piece of scrap iron. "With what?" Kaelin asked tiredly. "A rusty nail? A broken bottle?" "With iron," she hissed. Kaelin paused. Iron. Not silver, but old iron still burned wolves, leaving nasty, festering wounds. She was serious. She was backed into a corner, and she was willing to fight the Alpha King. A strange, unfamiliar feeling flickered in Kaylin's chest, cutting through the nausea and the instinct. Respect. "What is your name?" he asked. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I need something to call you other than girl." Silence. He heard her shifting slightly, the fabric of her coarse tunic scraping against the stone. "Rowan," she finally breathed out. "Rowan," Kaylin repeated. The name felt heavy on his tongue. It fit her scent, wood and resilience. "Come out, Rowan. I'm not going to hurt you." "Liar," she spat. "Alphas always hurt Omegas. It is the nature of the beast." Kaylin flinched. She wasn't wrong. The history of their kind was written in the subjugation of the weaker dynamics, and he was the apex of that violent hierarchy. Why should she trust him? He didn't even trust himself right now. "I won't touch you," Kaylin promised. "I swear it on the blood of my line. Just come into the light. Let me see you." He waited. He didn't use his aura. He pulled his power back, reeling it in tight until it coiled painfully in his gut. He made himself small. He leaned against the barrel, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to look unthreatening. Minutes passed. The damp cold of the cellar seeped into Kaylin's bad knee, making it throb with a dull, rhythmic ache. Finally, a shadow moved within the gap. She slid out slowly, like a feral cat anticipating a trap. She kept her back pressed to the stone wall. In the dim light filtering down from the stairwell, Kaylin finally saw her clearly. She was a mess. Her face was smeared with old dirt and fresh soot. Her tunic was stained with grease and what looked like old blood from the slaughterhouse. In her right hand, she gripped a rusted iron barrel tap like a dagger. Her knuckles were white, but her eyes, they were wide, terrified, and a piercing pale amber. They caught the faint light and glowed with a desperate, trapped energy. She wasn't beautiful in any conventional sense. She looked starved and feral. But looking at her, Kaylin felt a profound, catastrophic settling in his chest. The empty, hollow ache that had defined the last 10 years of his life simply vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute certainty. He didn't move. He kept his hands visible, crossed over his chest. Rowan stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at his fine clothes, the heavy silver rings on his fingers, the jagged scar traversing his throat. She looked at the raw power radiating from his massive frame, even as he tried to suppress it. "You're shaking," she observed, her voice barely a whisper, a trace of wonder cutting through the fear. Kaylin looked down at his own hands. They were trembling slightly against his doublet. He looked back up at her, a cynical, weary smile touching the corner of his mouth. "So are you," he replied. They stood there in the damp, freezing cellar, surrounded by rot and shadows. The Alpha King and the forgotten Omega. Neither of them moved. The bond strung between them hummed a live wire, dangerous, untested, and terrifyingly real. "What happens now?" Rowan asked, her grip on the iron tap tightening. Kaylin let out a slow breath. "I have absolutely no idea." Kaylin stepped back. It was the hardest physical movement he had ever executed. His boots dragged against the damp flagstones as if the gravity in the cellar had tripled. His inner wolf threw itself against his ribs, howling in absolute outrage at the retreat. "Coward. Mine. Take." The beast was a blunt instrument, incapable of understanding nuance, incapable of understanding the rusted iron tap trembling in Rowan's white-knuckled grip. "I am leaving," Kaylin stated. His voice sounded like two stones grinding together. "I am going to walk up those stairs, and I am going to close the door." Rowan didn't blink. Her pale amber eyes remained fixed on his chest, tracking his breathing. She didn't lower the weapon. "If anyone asks," Kaylin continued, fighting a wave of nausea that rolled through his gut, "I was inspecting the winter reserves. You were doing your duties." "They won't ask," Rowan replied, her voice flat, devoid of hope. "They don't see me." Kaylin's jaw tightened. He wanted to tell her that times He times saw her. That she was currently the only thing in the universe he could see clearly, a burning beacon of ice and copper in a world he had long considered entirely gray. But he knew how it would sound. It would sound like a lie, a trap. He forced himself to turn around. The muscles in his back screamed in protest, anticipating a strike that he knew wasn't coming, but instinct demanded he face the mate. He walked toward the stairs. Every step felt like he was stretching a thick, physical cable attached directly to his sternum. When he reached the bottom step, he paused, his hand gripping the cold, damp wood of the railing. "I won't forget, Rowan," he said quietly into the dark. "And neither will you." He didn't wait for her response. He climbed the stairs and shut the heavy oak door behind him, plunging her back into the dark. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in slow, agonizing deterioration. Kalen's body began to turn on him. The mating bond, violently awakened and immediately suppressed, demanded a resolution. His rational mind refused to force. By the second morning, the physical symptoms were impossible to hide. The fever. A low-grade, persistent heat settled in his bones. His skin felt too tight. He was constantly sweating, dampening the collars of his linen shirts. The agitation. The chronic pain in his knee vanished, replaced by a hypervigilant, restless energy. He couldn't sit in his council chair for more than 10 minutes without needing to pace. The sensory overload. His hearing had become excruciatingly sharp. The scratching of Brahm's quill on parchment sounded like a knife scraping glass. "My king, you are bleeding," Brahm said slowly, stopping his quill mid-sentence. Kalen looked down. He was sitting at the heavy slate table in the war room, reviewing grain tallies from the eastern provinces. He had been clenching his fist so hard that his blunt fingernails had pierced the calluses of his own palm. A slow trickle of dark blood was pooling on the parchment. Kalen grabbed a rag from the table and wrapped it tightly around his hand. "It is nothing. Continue with the report." "I will not," Brahm said, pushing his chair back. The older wolf's eyes were narrowed, tracking the sweat on Kalen's brow and the violent, dilated state of his pupils. "You reek of ozone and burnt blood, Kalen. You look like you did during the siege of Highfell. You are feral." "What happened at the feast?" "Nothing happened. You crushed a goblet of pure silver and vanished for 3 hours. The servants are terrified to enter your chambers. You haven't slept." Brahm leaned forward, resting his heavy knuckles on the slate. "The pack feels it. The alphas in the lower guard are agitated. The omegas are hiding. You are bleeding your instability into the stones of Ethelgard." Kalen closed his eyes. The smell of the rag in his hand, cheap linen, dust, old lie, pulled his mind violently back to the subcellars. He could smell Times her. Even now, 2 floors up and 100 yards away, he could pinpoint her exact location in the keep. She was in the outer scullery courtyard. She was cold. She was washing pots. And she was distressed. The realization didn't come as a thought. It hit him like a physical blow to the back of the knees. Kalen gasped, his eyes snapping open. The slate gray of his irises was completely gone, swallowed by a predatory, luminous gold. "Kalen?" Brahm's voice shifted from authoritative to alarmed. Kalen didn't answer. He vaulted over the slate table, sending inkwells and parchment scattering across the floor. He hit the heavy wooden doors of the war room at a dead sprint, tearing them open so violently the iron hinges screamed. Down in the outer courtyard, the winter wind was brutal. It whipped off the northern mountains, carrying tiny, stinging granules of ice. Rowan knelt on the frozen cobblestones. Her hands were plunged into a wooden trough of freezing, greasy water. She was scrubbing a massive iron cauldron with a handful of coarse river sand. Her knuckles were split and bleeding, the raw skin burning violently against the harsh lye soap. She was exhausted. The last 2 days had been a waking nightmare. She had waited for the king's guards to come drag her away. She had waited for the sneers, the violence, the inevitable end of her quiet, miserable existence. But no one came. Instead, a strange, phantom heat had settled under her skin. Whenever the wind shifted, She thought she smelled thunderstorms and wood smoke. It made her stomach clench with a terrifying hollow ache that she fiercely tried to ignore. "You missed a spot, Rat." Rowan froze. The heavy shadow of a man fell over her, blocking the weak winter sun. It was Corin, a beta guard from the outer perimeter. He was a vicious, petty man who took out the frustrations of his low rank on the servants. He held a leather riding crop, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He stank of cheap ale, unwashed leather, and sour aggression. "I said, you missed a spot," Corin repeated, stepping closer. The toe of his steel-capped boot nudged her thigh. Rowan kept her head down. "I will wash it again, sir." She grabbed another handful of wet sand and leaned over the trough, rubbing frantically at the scorched bottom of the cauldron. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Omegas did not look betas in the eye. They did not talk back. They survived by becoming part of the floor. "You're shaking," Corin sneered, leaning down. He grabbed the back of her coarse wool tunic, bunching the fabric in his massive fist. "Look at me when I talk to you, filth." He yanked her backward. Rowan cried out as her knees scraped harshly across the frozen cobblestones. She lost her balance, her hands flying out to catch herself, splashing the freezing, greasy lye water all over her own chest and Corin's boots. Corin swore violently. "You stupid, clumsy bitch." He raised the riding crop. Rowan cringed, throwing her raw, bleeding hands up over her face, bracing for the crack of leather against her cheek. She squeezed her eyes shut. The blow never landed. Instead, a sound ripped through the courtyard. It wasn't a shout. It was a guttural, earth-shaking roar that vibrated the very cobblestones beneath Rowan's knees. It was the sound of an apex predator completely losing its mind. Rowan opened her eyes just in time to see the heavy oak doors of the keep explode outward. Wood splintered and shrapnel rained down on the frost-covered ground. Kalen hit the courtyard like a siege weapon. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't issue a command. He simply crossed the 30 yards of open space in a blur of terrifying, impossible speed. Corin didn't even have time to turn his head. Kalen's hand clamped around the guard's throat. The momentum lifted Corin completely off his feet. Kalen slammed him backward into the stone wall of the armory with a sickening, heavy crunch. The stone cracked. The riding crop clattered uselessly to the floor. Silence descended on the courtyard. The 3 other scullery maids who had been working nearby dropped their buckets and fell to their knees, pressing their faces to the ice, terrified to even breathe. Kalen stood over Corin. The king's chest was heaving. He wore no cloak, just a fine linen shirt that was soaked in sweat. His eyes were burning gold. Note: his lips were pulled back, exposing elongated, lethal canines. A low, vibrating growl rattled in his chest, a sound that demanded blood. Corin was choking, his hands desperately clawing at Kalen's wrist. His face was turning a dark, mottled purple. "Mine," Kalen snarled, the word distorted by the shape of his shifting jaw. Rowan realized with a jolt of sheer terror that Kalen was going to kill him. He was going to crush Corin's windpipe right there in the courtyard, in front of everyone. And he was doing it for her. The invisibility she had spent 6 years cultivating was completely, irreparably destroyed. "Stop!" Rowan screamed. She didn't think. She scrambled up from the ice, her wet clothes clinging to her freezing skin. She threw herself forward, grabbing Kalen's forearm. The king's skin was boiling hot. It was like grabbing an iron stove. Kalen froze. The moment her cold, wet hands touched his skin, the violent trembling in his muscles stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The gold in his eyes flickered, fighting a desperate war against the slate gray of his human consciousness. "Let him go!" Rowan gasped, her fingers digging into his hard, scarred muscle. "Please! You're making everyone look!" Kalen stared down at her hands. He looked at her split knuckles, bleeding sluggishly into the freezing water that soaked her sleeves. He let out a ragged, shuddering breath. He opened his hand. Corin dropped to the cobblestones like a sack of grain, coughing violently, retching as he scrambled backward on his hands and knees, desperate to get away from the king. Kalen didn't look at the guard. He swayed on his feet, suddenly looking incredibly fragile. The violent surge of adrenaline crashed, leaving nothing but the crippling, consuming fever of the bond. His eyelids fluttered. Without a word, Kalen's eyes rolled back in his head, and his massive frame collapsed forward. Rowan braced herself, catching him by the shoulders. His dead weight drove her back down to the freezing cobblestones. He landed heavily against her, his head falling into the crook of her neck. He smelled of ozone, burning wood, and absolute exhaustion. The courtyard was dead silent, save for the howling wind and the panicked gasps of the choking guard. Rowan sat on the ice, the Alpha King unconscious in her lap. She looked around at the terrified faces of the other servants staring at her. Her life as a shadow was over. They didn't take him to the royal wing. When Brahm and the royal guard finally rushed into the courtyard, Rowan refused to let them touch him. It wasn't a conscious decision. Her Omega instincts, previously battered and dormant, suddenly flared with a vicious territorial hiss. She had bared her teeth at Brahm, a ridiculous, suicidal gesture for a scullion, but Brahm had simply raised his hands and backed away, recognizing the raw, volatile nature of a claiming in progress. Instead, they moved him to a quiet, forgotten guardroom off the lower armory. It was a utilitarian space, stone walls, a massive iron hearth, and a single, heavy cot bolted to the floor. No silk, no velvet. Brahm ordered a fire built, dismissed the guards, and left Rowan alone with the unconscious king. The fire roared in the grate, casting long, flickering shadows across Kalen's face. Rowan sat on a low wooden stool beside the cot. She had a bowl of clean, warm water and a linen cloth. She was still shivering. Her own clothes had dried stiff, smelling of lye and old grease. She looked at the man lying on the cot. Stripped of his heavy doublet and his iron crown, Kalen looked less like a monster and more like a casualty of war. His chest was wrapped in a network of thick, silvery scars, claw marks, blade slices, burn tissue. His face, relaxed in unconsciousness, showed the deep, permanent lines of a man who carried too much weight for too long. He was sweating profusely. The mating fever was trying to burn the resistance out of him. Rowan dipped the cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and hesitated. Her whole life, alphas had been synonymous with pain. They were loud, violent, and inherently dangerous. To willingly touch one felt like putting her hand directly into a trap. But looking at Kalen, she didn't feel terror. She felt a strange heavy tug in the center of her chest, an anchor dropping into deep water. She reached out and pressed the damp cloth against Kalen's forehead. Kalen let out a long, ragged exhale. The harsh tension in his jaw melted. He leaned into her touch unconsciously, a soft, pathetic sound vibrating in his throat. It was a whimper. The Alpha King was whimpering. Rowan's breath hitched. She traced the cloth down his temple, wiping away the cold sweat, following the line of the jagged scar on his throat. His skin was rough, calloused, but incredibly warm. "You are an idiot," Rowan whispered to the empty room. "You are going to get me killed." "Not while I breathe," a rough voice rasped. Rowan snatched her hand back, startled. Kalen's eyes were open. The gold was gone, replaced by his natural slate-gray irises, though they were bloodshot and heavy with exhaustion. He didn't move. He just laid there, looking at her in the firelight. "I thought you were asleep," Rowan said, her voice defensively sharp. She gripped the damp cloth tightly in her lap. "I was burning," Kalen corrected, his voice a low, gravelly scrape. "And then I felt ice." He looked at her hands. "Your knuckles are bleeding." Rowan curled her fingers inward, hiding the raw skin. "It's nothing. Lye soap and sand. The life of a scullion." "You are not a scullion anymore." "I am what I am," Rowan snapped, the bitter reality of her existence rising up to choke her. "You think because you dragged me out of the dirt that I suddenly belong in the sky? I don't know how to be a queen, or a consort, or whatever twisted thing you want from me. I know how to scrape marrow out of bones. I know how to stay quiet." Kalen slowly pushed himself up. His muscles shook with the effort, but he managed to sit on the edge of the cot, leaning his elbows on his knees. He was a massive, imposing figure, even slouched in exhaustion. He looked at her, his expression utterly devoid of the arrogance she expected from royalty. "Rowan," Kalen said quietly, "look around you." Rowan frowned, glancing at the bare stone walls, the racks of dull iron swords, the cracked floorboards. "I hate the high tables," Kalen confessed, running a heavy hand over his face. "I hate the silk. I hate the perfume. I hate the politics. I have spent 10 years pretending to be a civilized king for a pack of vipers who would cut my throat for a copper coin." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze stripped the air from Rowan's lungs. "I don't want a queen who knows how to smile and pour wine," Kalen said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper that resonated perfectly with the hum of the bond between them. "I want someone who knows the reality of the dirt. I want someone who has survived it. I want you." Rowan stared at him. Her heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird battering against her ribs. She searched his face for a lie, for a trace of mockery. She found only a brutal, exhausting honesty. "You don't even know me," she argued weakly. "Then teach me," Kalen countered. He reached out slowly, keeping his hand low, palm up, resting it on the space of the cot between them. An invitation, not a demand. "I am not asking you to become someone else, Rowan. I am asking you to let me be the shield that stands between you and the wind." Rowan looked at his large, scarred hand. She remembered the sheer violence he had unleashed in the courtyard, how he had been willing to murder a man just for raising a hand to her. She remembered how his skin felt under hers, hot, desperate, grounding. She was terrified. She was deeply, profoundly cynical about a world that had only ever shown her its teeth. But as she looked at Kalen, she realized that he wasn't offering her a fairy tale. He was offering her an alliance of survival. Two broken, exhausted wolves, choosing to limp forward together rather than die alone. Slowly, her hand trembling, Rowan reached out. She didn't place her palm flat against his. She tentatively touched her bruised, calloused fingertips to the deep scar running across his knuckles. The moment they connected, the heavy, suffocating tension that had gripped them both for 2 days completely evaporated. The invisible cable between them didn't snap. It settled, weaving itself into the very marrow of their bones. Kalen let out a deep, shuddering breath, his head dropping forward as the last of the fever broke. He turned his hand over, gently curling his fingers around hers. He didn't squeeze, he just held on, anchoring himself to her quiet, stubborn strength. "What now?" Rowan whispered, the firelight catching the tears she stubbornly refused to shed. Kalen looked up at her, a small, genuine, and deeply tired smile touching his scarred lips. "Now," the king said, "we burn the rest of it down and start over." Thank you for watching this story. If you felt the raw tension and grounded emotion of Kalen and Rowan's unexpected bond, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this video with fellow romance and fantasy lovers who appreciate a story where the characters are beautifully flawed and fiercely real. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next immersive audio drama. Leave a comment below with your favorite moment.